Hello, it's Tuesday, the 19th of April 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson, and today we're mostly focusing on Yemen. And I'm delighted to say we're joined by Vanessa Beeley. Welcome to the programme, Vanessa.
Thank you, Mike. It's good to be back on.
Okay, well, we are going to just give a little bit of background here, remind everybody where Yemen is, because of course this is a conflict which has been going on for quite a long time now, but has had almost no coverage, no serious coverage anyway, in the mainstream press. Yemen to the south of Saudi Arabia there, this is what Wikipedia says, at least, about how it is currently divided up. So they're calling it a civil war. We'll talk about that in a second. We've got the Revolutionary Committee in the Greens section. We've got the Hadi-led government, and we'll talk about who Hadi is in 1 second. In the red section, and of course, increasingly we've got Al Qaeda and ISIS involvement in the country as well. So, Vanessa, could we just begin with a brief explanation of who the main sort of characters in this are, and where they've come from, and what this is about?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very important point to counteract certainly the US and the Gulf and even NATO propaganda that is running alongside this conflict. I won't go into huge detail about the different factions leading up to Hadi's appointment as president in 2012.
So this is Mansour Hadi, and as you say, he president of Yemen since 2012, or is he actually?
Well, this is the bone of contention over which everybody is fighting. Basically, Hadi was brought in a sort of very much a one-horse race, and obviously, or it became very obvious as a Saudi puppet installed in Yemen after the Arab Spring, which deposed Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had been leading the country for 30 years. However, I do have to say it was a revolution that, although it started with grassroots activism, it was, of course, hijacked in order to put Hadi in place. Hadi was basically voted into power via the GCC initiative, the Gulf Cooperation Council initiative. And the intention really was for him to only be in power for 2 years, so until 2014. And in that time, he had promised to produce a new constitution and also for general elections to be called at the end of that mandate, of that 2-year mandate. It's also important to say that the GCC initiative was not signed off by, if you like, the majority of the Yemeni people. So it was not representative of the Yemeni people anyway. And then in 2014, basically the various political factions that had signed off the GCC initiative took the decision on their own independently to extend Hadi's term of presidency. So it didn't go out to vote. The reason that they said they were doing this is because the constitution had not yet been written. And they said that elections had to be delayed until that point. So despite having had 2 years to write this constitution, it had to be extended a further year for Hadi to be able to write it and for general elections to be held. Now, if we move forward quickly to February 2015, Hadi resigned. He resigned his post. And at that point, equally, his GCC extended mandate had expired. So on 2 counts there, we can say quite clearly, legally, that Hadi is no longer president of Yemen. So that sort of deconstructs the legitimacy of that argument. Hadi was then actually asked again by the same committee that had signed off on the GCC initiative to come back and to retake the presidency. He refused. So if you like, he resigned twice before he then fled to Aden, from where he then suddenly, probably under pressure from his Saudi masters, decided to suddenly renew his interest in the presidency. And he initially wanted to set the government up in Aden, which is in the southern port, as opposed to Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen. And of course, then basically the Yemeni army had by then turned very much against him, and in danger of being sort of captured in Aden, he fled to Riyadh, from where he called upon Saudi Arabia to bomb his own people, basically, in order to reinstate him as president. So I hope that explains a little. I mean, it's more complex than that, but that very simplistically explains the situation. Even some independent commentators are saying that the Houthis deposed Hadi. That's not true. Hadi resigned, and we'll come on to this in a little bit. But then the Yemeni people and the various political factions then went forward to produce the Peace and National Partnership Agreement. And as this was coming to fruition, and as a peaceful political solution was being found, and I can quote here from the UN Special Envoy, who testified to this in his statement of the 28th of April 2015, when this campaign started, in other words, when Saudi Arabia started to bomb Yemen, which was on the 26th of March 2015, one thing that was significant but went unnoticed is that the Yemenis were close to a deal that would institute power sharing with all sides, including the Houthis. So that's basically the run-up to the start of the war of aggression against Yemen, because there's no legitimacy to this genocidal conflict as far as legal terminology is. There's no basis in legality at all.
So this is a key point. Just to reiterate it, there was a peace settlement on the table pretty much the day that Saudi Arabia began bombing.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, now then what followed was a Security Council resolution from the United Nations. This is 2216. And this, well, tell us what this was about and who instigated it.
Well, I mean, I've actually been, I was actually in the UNHRC for the 31st session during the month of March. I was testifying on behalf of the Yemenis against...
That's March this year.
Yes, against Saudi Arabia, particularly for the illegal use of US-supplied cluster munitions on civilian targets. But what was interesting during my time in the UN, what we realized more and more, that this UN resolution 2216 is in fact, it's a deliberate collective punishment, or it's being abused, let's say, to deliberately collectively punish the Yemeni people. If we go back to this resolution 2216, one, it is based entirely upon the legitimacy of President Hadi. So it's already based in an illegitimate argument, if you like. And before this resolution came into force or was adopted, there were various letters, one in particular from the Gulf Institute in Washington, decrying this resolution and saying, you know, there is no legal argument for the legitimacy of President Hadi. Therefore, this resolution should not go ahead. Unfortunately, the UN chose to ignore all legal arguments that were being put forward and the opinion of the Yemeni people to go ahead with this resolution. But the very important fact about this resolution, Mike, that we have to highlight is that we're seeing once more the UN is moving in lockstep with the aggressor and the human rights violator, as it did in Iraq, when, if you remember, it sanctioned crippling and punishing embargoes against the Iraqi people that eventually led to the starvation of over 500,000 children, not to mention the adults. What we are seeing here, again, I was talking with Professor Francis Boyle, who's a law professor in Illinois who specializes in these cases. And to quote from him, the UN embargo and blockade against Yemen and the Yemenis violates Genocide Convention Article 2 E, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. If we go back to Resolution 2216, it's an embargo against 5 named individuals. It's not against 27 million Yemenis, but it's been expanded to include a complete land, air, and sea blockade against 27 million Yemenis. And we are seeing a repeat of what we saw in Iraq. We're seeing starving children, we're seeing complete humanitarian aid blockades. We're seeing the Saudis bombing humanitarian aid convoys that are managing to get equipment, for instance, from Sana'a, the capital, to the north. They are being bombed on the road. So, you know, we're seeing a staggering complicity from the UN in what can only be called a genocide, and it should be called a genocide.
Oh, okay. Well, if we look at Wikipedia and look at the mainstream media, of course, it's being described as a civil war, as we mentioned a moment ago. But aside from the fact that the Saudis are clearly bombing these people, it's not just the Saudis. We've got reports of Blackwater mercenaries and other mercenaries from other countries fighting for Saudi Arabia in Yemen. And of course, as you've just mentioned, of course, we have the use of cluster bombs, and this is an image of what it looks like inside a cluster bomb. So this is dropped, and when it hits the ground, it distributes a whole load of other bombs around the area. This in itself is a crime against humanity. But just to discuss a little about the use of foreign mercenaries, because this is clearly not a civil war under those circumstances.
No, it's not. I mean, it's not. It's nothing like a civil war. I mean, for one thing, as we've explained, there was a peace agreement on the table that would have ensured resolution between the disputing factions, such as they were, and you know, that resolution has been completely ignored by all the parties involved. I think another very important point to make is of the 5 permanent members on the UN Security Council, 3 are backing Saudi Arabia. So you have the UK, the US, and France. The UK has sold, as we know, over 2.8 billion in arms to Saudi Arabia since the conflict began. The US a staggering 33 billion. Lockheed Martin has just set up technology centers in Saudi Arabia to manage the weapons that they're selling to Saudi Arabia. And France, as we know, has just signed off on an incredible deal of $7.5 billion to Qatar, who are a member of the Saudi coalition. So yes, if we look at this so-called, as it's being portrayed, civil war, it consists of a coalition of 10 nations. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Senegal, and Sudan. And then on top of that, as you've quite rightly mentioned, we have the mercenaries that are being imported by Saudi Arabia because basically they're too terrified to fight the Houthis on the ground, it has to be said. So they're bringing in paid mercenaries to do that job for them. And they're failing dismally. I mean, fundamentally, what we also have to understand is that on the ground, the Houthis are making, or Ansarullah, as I will call them, again, the media narrative in the West and in the Gulf is very much the Houthi rebels. What we have to understand is that Ansarullah is now a movement. The Houthis, by the way, if we're collectively punishing the Yemeni nation because the Houthis have dared to resist Saudi neocolonialism and oppression, are less than 1% of that population. And what people are, again, overlooking, and I was speaking to someone quite recently about this, is that Ansarullah is no longer a sort of a warring faction from the north that is fed up that it's not being represented in the government in Yemen. It's now become a sort of universal movement that has also incorporated Ali Abdullah Saleh's party, the General People's Congress, to some extent. In other words, they make allies because they are both opposed to Saudi occupation or proxy occupation. But what we need to really understand is that the Ansarullah movement has become an incredibly popular movement among the Yemeni people because they perceive it to be a movement that is resisting Saudi oppression and above all corruption. Yemen has lived about 40 years now under Saudi corruption, blackmail, bribery of their leadership, and they don't, they will not accept this anymore. And so Ansarullah, if you like, has been the beacon that they've all headed towards, but it's now become a huge movement. So it can no longer be described as purely the Houthi rebels. It's a popular resistance movement against the Saudi coalition.
Right. Well, before we move on from this, obviously the third group, the white group, if we remember that map that we showed a few minutes ago, was labeled as Al Qaeda and Al Qaeda affiliates, which include ISIS, I suppose. So what is their part in this? Are they simply taking advantage of the overall chaos, or is it the case that that there are other external forces pushing them into this region?
Well, again, that's an interesting question. I would say that it's very clear that prior to the Saudi war of aggression against Yemen, the Yemeni army and the Houthi fighters were actually dispatching ISIS AQAP very successfully. They've driven them out of most provinces where they had taken any degree of control or power. And they were on the way to completely eradicating it from Yemen. But then, interestingly, and we can speculate to a huge extent here, the Saudi bombing did AQAP and ISIS a huge favor, because obviously, the greatest threat to the Houthis is not on the ground, it's from the air. And so while they are being attacked from the air, they're unable to be as effective on the ground as they could be. I was actually speaking to someone last night in Yemen, and he said to me, look, if the air campaign stopped, we would cleanse Yemen of AQAP and ISIS in weeks. He said, they're not a threat to us. We can get rid of them. And honestly, having seen the way the Houthis fight on the ground, I completely believe that. So we have to summarize that we're seeing, again, if you like, a deliberate creation of that familiar terror vacuum that we've seen in Libya. We've seen it attempted in Syria, which are currently being foiled, we're glad to say. But again, I think, yes, they're trying to create exactly the same situation in Yemen, because, again, the bombing has not been against, if you like, conflicting parties. It's been, as usual, on civilian infrastructure, on schools, on hospitals, on mosques, on centers of education, wedding parties. It's been predominantly civilian targets.
And is the Wall Street Journal here correct to suggest that this is about oil?
I think it's again, it's quite a complex situation as regards even the oil. But if you look at the Gulf states, if you look at geographically the Gulf states, you have only Saudi Arabia is able to run an east to west pipeline. But we know that after, I think, 2001, they converted their only east-west pipeline to gas. And it would take some time for them to reconvert it back to crude oil, to carry crude oil. So if you look at this map, what I wanted to make very clear, on the east, you have the Straits of Hormuz, which of course are governed by Iran, which is Saudi Arabia's arch enemy in the region. And to the left, to the west, you have the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, which are controlled at the moment by Yemen. If you look at the center of Yemen, just north and to the east of Sana'a, the capital, which is an area of huge conflict. It's where some of the fiercest clashes are being seen between the Saudi coalition forces on the ground and the Revolutionary Committee forces. There you have the oil and gas fields in Al Jawf, further to the north, and in Marib, obviously, you have the current oil reserves. Then if you look to the south of Yemen, you will see where AQAP, Al-Qaeda, Arab Peninsula, and ISIS have taken control. And if you consider the fact that that is the entire, Yemen basically has about 1,000 miles of coastline. And most of that coastline now is under ISIS AQAP control. And we know from various WikiLeaks cables that the plan or the projection for Saudi Arabia was to run a pipeline directly from Al Jauf and Marib down to the south, perhaps to Aden, perhaps to Hadramaut, in order to be able to bypass both the Straits of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, hence negating, if you like, the Iranian logistical hegemony, but even their regional hegemony in a lot of ways. So yes, I think oil is tremendously, it's vital. Added to which also, if we look at the other Gulf states, they don't have the potential of the East-West pipeline. They're entirely dependent upon the Straits of Hormuz and therefore upon Iran. So yeah, the importance, the geostrategic importance of Yemen to Saudi Arabia should not be downplayed by any means.
But it's not just to Saudi Arabia, it's to the West, which is one of the reasons why we're giving so much support at the moment. Is that unfair?
Absolutely. I mean, yes, you know, as we've said, the support, the criminal support that is coming in from the West, and you know, it cannot be described as anything else. I mean, when we have our London Defence Ministry, and I'm quoting here, claims non-involvement in war making on behalf of Saudi Arabia, and they dare to claim that they're training the Saudis to comply with international rules of war. Well, I'm a little bit confused as to what they consider to be the rules of war. And then we also have the US and UK present in the control and command centers in Riyadh. The claim is that they have no say in the targeting, and particularly the targeting of civilian areas, which is 99% of the Saudi targets. But they're in the control tower, and they're supplying the weapons that are then being used to target civilians illegally and against all and violating all humanitarian laws, and yet they're sort of washing their hands of it. And we know that all of the UK arms and weapons contracts to Saudi Arabia are, if you like, they put up the smoke and mirrors in the sense that they say they're only supplying components. If you look at the actual contracts, they don't describe exactly what they're supplying. But we know that, for instance, in one bombing in Sana'a in 2015 of a factory, I think it was Human Rights Watch, actually found remains of a UK manufactured cruise missile, which was used against a civilian target. And yet we seem to be successfully avoiding any sort of responsibility. And you know, the US is not a signatory of the Cluster Munitions Convention. However, their own export regulations state very clearly that this weapon should never be used against civilian targets, and it should meet its less than 1% failure rate, which is basically when the bomblets are released, less than 1% should remain unexploded on the ground as a de facto landmine. Well, that, you know, even if they are not signatories of the Cluster Munitions Convention, Saudi Arabia is still flouting every single humanitarian law in their use of the cluster munitions that are being supplied. It seems perfectly willingly by the United States to carry out a genocidal war against civilians.
Now, one of the meetings, or one of the continuing meetings that you wanted to highlight, was the fact that Philip Hammond had been meeting with Prince Mohammed bin Nayef. What was your particular concern about this?
Well, I mean, you know, how we are not up in absolute horror at this. I mean, Hammond is meeting with one of the world's greatest executioners. He's meeting with him, and I see that you put up my favorite picture there of Francois Hollande presenting the same executioner, Bin Naif is the interior minister. So basically, the reason I'm calling him an executioner, although I consider all of the Saudi regime to be executioners in one way, shape, or form. Bin Naif is the interior minister, so he is the person who will actually make the decision whether somebody should be beheaded, crucified, stoned, whatever other wonderful form of annihilation of human beings that they can come up with. And again, this brings me back. So we're seeing, if you like, this approval of this absolute monarchy, the only absolute monarchy in the world, by our politicians, by the Hammonds, by Francois Hollande, by Cameron, by the United States. At the same time, also, again, running in lockstep, we're seeing the UN appointing them to a key human rights panel within the United Nations Human Rights Commission. So in other words, they're giving them carte blanche to decide upon what constitutes human rights globally, not only internally, but externally, which is, I mean, it's sort of beyond insane. You know, these people are complete mass murderers. There's no other way to describe it. Their level of parajudicial executions in their own country and the oppression of the Saudi regime against their own country is second to none on this planet.
Okay, well, look, let's move on to the NGO factor, because US aid, well, they have suspended aid to Yemen for a year. And something that you wanted to highlight here was that that almost at the same time that they suspended that aid to Yemen, we had the creation of this organization, the King Salman Human Rights and the King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center. What is this organization up to in Yemen at the moment then?
Well, the King's, as you quite rightly said, I think we actually talked about this on an earlier program regarding Yemen. But yeah, you're quite right. In July 2015, USAID basically turned off the aid tap to Yemen because it considered that the conflict was too difficult to try and get around to get the aid into Yemen. Almost immediately or simultaneously, the King Salman Center was set up. And a UN source was actually quoted as saying that he expected it to operate as the Gulf states equivalent of US aid. So we're almost immediately seeing this collusion between the United Nations, the US aid, in this creation of an NGO, which is then going to humanitarian, in a humanitarian aspect, repair the damage that it's doing by bombing Yemen in the first place. I mean, this is the sort of, you know, as I said before, the chutzpah of this can only be compared to Israel flattening Gaza and then being tasked and paid to rebuild it. It's exactly the same process. And during the time that I spent in the UNHRC, I had the misfortune to attend the King Salman Center presentation to the UN, in which they described themselves as saviors of all humanity and huge contributors to the better of mankind.
Well, I mean, they must be, because they've got all these people in partnership with them.
Absolutely. And I was just going to say, at the end of this hideously hypocritical presentation, those that stood up to commend them upon their humanitarian philanthropy were, among others, OCHA, UNICEF, and a few others. But UNICEF in particular took the stand, if you like, and said very clearly, like, you know, we commend Saudi Arabia on its efforts to combat the humanitarian situations in this world, and we look forward to future years of collaboration. So there can't be, for me, there can't be any clearer declaration from the United Nations that it is working in lockstep with a known genocidal regime, both internally and now externally, not only in Yemen, but I mean, globally, we know that Saudi Arabia has invested huge manpower in the terrorist factions in Syria. It's funded the terrorist factions in Syria. It is now genocidally bombing Yemen. I mean, the peace process, which is supposed to be ongoing right now, that since the ceasefire began, there's been absolutely no change in modus operandi from Saudi Arabia. It's continued bombing and violating,
And
even that
sorry,
ceasefire.
sorry, and indeed the peace process seems to be on hold in the meantime, because the ceasefire, there is no ceasefire.
Well, I think a huge respect to the Yemeni people and to those that represent them, which are the various Yemeni factions that are heading to Kuwait. I believe that they are actually now, if not there, they are on their way there. But yes, initially yesterday they released a statement and they said, well, we're not going to discuss peace while we are still being bombed. Um, and as the contact that I spoke to last night said, he said, if the US and NATO are so keen on ridding the world of ISIS and AQAP, stop Saudi Arabia bombing, and then we can get rid of them. In 2 weeks, we can get them out of Yemen. We can completely exterminate them. So, are we seeing again this complete the double speak or treble speak? I don't know what you call it. But one comment that came from a Yemeni academic that I spoke to when I heard that the Yemeni factions were not going to be going to Kuwait. And he actually, and I'll quote him, he said, "We've suffered 40 years of Saudi neocolonialism, oppression and corruption, and it has to come to an end. We could lose just about everything their bombs could destroy, but our freedom and our liberty is indispensable." And I think this is what the Sauds and their alliance, their coalition, and that includes the US and NATO, this is what they keep underestimating, is the power of the people's resistance against this form of violent and brutal neocolonialism. We're seeing it being halted. We've seen it halted in Syria. And now we're seeing Yemen, that has been pretty much abandoned to fight its own battles. It's still succeeding in doing that, which is extraordinary to me.
Yeah. Yes. Well, okay. So we're going to show some images in a second, which some people may find a little disturbing, but I think it's fair enough to sort of not underestimate what is actually happening to people in Yemen. Now, you've been quite prolific in the last couple of weeks on 21st Century Wire. And this is one of your articles, again, making the point that the UN is whitewashing the war crimes in Yemen. And one of these is the fact that that children and babies are starving at the moment. This is pretty hard. And of course, cluster bombs, another example of that is the number of children that are losing limbs, because as you say, they may claim that only, in inverted commas, 1% of the bombs fail to explode, but as you say, these become de facto landmines. And then there was this hugely tragic story. Tell us about this one.
Yeah, this is the story of Abdul and Marwan. They were basically they were from Hadja, which is in the north, which is the area that has been hardest hit, particularly by the cluster munitions. Of the over 60 recorded instances or uses of cluster munitions, Sada and Hadja have been hit probably over 35 times now. And we're pretty sure that this was a cluster munition hit. The 12 members of their family were massacred in this one strike. These two boys, as you can see, are suffering what looks very similar to the napalm burns that we saw in Vietnam and in other areas as well, but particularly in Vietnam. They were on their own for 2 weeks until they were found in this appalling state, having been on their own, having lost their entire family. Those that found them tried to take them for treatment. The local hospitals were unable to treat them because, again, they've been targeted and bombed. They don't have electricity. They don't have the medical equipment. So they had to be taken a lot further. And during that journey, they died. So I think where their story, for me, I just find incredibly moving because it's so representative of what is actually happening in Yemen. The use of cluster munitions, just to explain what they do, the outer casing detonates in midair and it releases up to 2,000 smaller bomblets, which can then cover an area of up to 30 acres. If you imagine, on a conservative basis, a large football pitch. So the molten, and actually it was Patrick that pointed out to me, they actually even score the outer casing so that when it explodes, and it's obviously molten metal at that point, the shards of metal are so sharp that if you just touch them with your finger, it'll cut your finger. So if you imagine 2,000 bomblets, absolutely piercingly sharp molten metal being spread across civilian areas like this, it's nothing. I mean, it's so hard to describe how criminal and how murderous this entire campaign is.
I think we're gonna end more or less with one final question, Vanessa, and that is, in your view, if Britain and the United States weren't driving this, if our government wasn't driving this, would it be happening in the way that it's happened? Would it be happening at all?
No, I don't think it would. I think if our governments did what they should be doing, which is to prevent any sort of illegal war of aggression, then this war would not exist. The people of Yemen would be creating their own government right now and probably living closer to the democratic principles that we keep foisting onto other nations when we can't even adhere to them ourselves. So put very bluntly, and I think, again, one other point very quickly to make is that the UN has failed, despite clamoring for them to do so, to actually send in an independent inquiry commission. The only commission in existence at the moment is a national commission, which is headed up by Hadi, funded by Saudi Arabia, and run by people who are Hadi loyalists. The UN has failed to put together an independent international commission that can go and investigate all of the war crimes, because there are going to be war crimes on both sides. But there's nothing in existence that can even be used as a barometer against which we can judge whether this war is illegal or not. There's nothing in existence. So no, this entire war of aggression is based completely in illegitimacy and illegality.
Yeah.
Supported by our governments and armed by our governments.
Indeed. So the problem, in order to solve this problem, we've got to deal with our governments. Is that
Yeah.
That's
Yes.
pretty much it. Right. Now, of course, you are going to be speaking at AV7 in May. I wanted to mention this. We mentioned this tweet from the Foreign Office yesterday, but I just wanted to get some comment on it from you, and maybe you could say something about what you'll be talking about at AV7. But Foreign Office here tweeting out yesterday that UK aid is helping to provide clean water, sanitation, and essential medicines and funding for NGOs and charities helping local people affected by Daesh.
Okay. Wouldn't it be an awful lot more useful if they just stopped creating Daesh? Well, thank you for the intro into what I'll be talking about at AV7. But what I will basically be covering, and we covered it a little bit today when we talked about the collusion between USAID and the King Salman Center, and you know, the creation of this entire humanitarian situation that need never have happened, but of course is now requiring NGO infiltration into that country in order to repair the damage that's been done. Basically, I'll be talking about the fact that NGOs are a capitalist hegemonic concept created by our own intelligence agencies, be it MI6 or be it CIA, in order, in a sense, to be used as fifth columnists, infiltrators into target nations, tenderizers of people, as I put it, mission creep organizations, most of them government funded, most of them state funded, most of them funded by non-philanthropic organizations and foundations. And I think the important thing, or the important idea to take away, is that capitalism is not going to create something that's going to sink its own ship. So anything that is being created out of capitalism, out of imperialism, is certainly not going to be allowed to become a tool that can be used against it. And if we put that in a very, in that simplistic way, it certainly alerts us to the danger of accepting NGOs as being the unassailable power for good, which they are definitely not.
Brilliant. Okay, well, look, thank you very much for joining us today, Vanessa. We'll have you again very, very soon, I hope. But in the meantime, I look forward to meeting you in May. And I'd like to say thank you very much to everybody for watching today. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow, 1 o'clock. See you then. Bye-bye.